Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us at this webinar today. From data to decarbonisation, confronting the challenges for road and rail. This event is part of the Decarbonising Transport Week 2024 agenda and is hosted by DARE, the new national hub for decarbonised, adaptable and resilient transport infrastructures. This webinar is being recorded and we are going to share the recording via both the soon-to-be launched DARE website and the Decarbonising Transport Week website as well. Please do send in your questions for our panel today. There is a Q&A function on the Zoom controls here, so please do share your questions. We'd love to hear from you today. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Phil Blythe, CBE, who is our chair for this webinar and the DARE Hub Director. Over to you, Phil. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. We have an hour in this webinar to discuss DARE and the topics around this. We've got a fantastic set of speakers to help us do that. I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes before I introduce the speakers, just setting the scene. DARE is a national hub that's been funded jointly by the UK Research Council, UKRI, through EPSRC, and through the Department for Transport. And it's uniquely there to try and bring together all the expertise in the UK into one hub, one-stop shop to help the DFT, other government departments and their arm's length bodies really think about the challenges, not just of decarbonisation, which we hear of a lot in terms of infrastructure, but also how do we adapt that infrastructure to deal with the challenges of climate change and extreme weather that we may see, will see in the future. And also how can we ensure that by making the decisions on decarbonisation and also on the adaptation, we can ensure that our future transport infrastructure is more resilient to the effects of climate change and other impacts that may happen with our transport system. And that's a real challenge, because sometimes what we do for decarbonisation may actually potentially have impacts on making the transport infrastructure and our transport systems and services less resilient. For example, electrification, the fact we'll be relying for road transport very much on electric. Does that actually improve the resilience or reduce the resilience of our transport system? New materials that we look at for building and maintaining our transport infrastructure, decarbonised concrete, composites replacing steel, for example, they're probably significantly reducing our carbon footprint in manufacture and maintenance. But in the long term, will that actually deliver the resilience we're looking for, particularly with the extremes of weather that we will encounter in the future? So that's the objective of this morning, to introduce you to DARE and in particular consider those challenges, and in particular how data in all its forms can help us deliver the objectives of DARE and really address this broad topic. So I'd like to introduce you to our panel. We have Dr. Ali Ford, who's a senior lecturer in geospatial analytics and a SchoolX climate fellow here at Newcastle University. We have Dan Clark, who's the head of innovation and technology at the Greater Cambridge Partnership. Hayley Fowler, who's Professor of Climate Change Impacts and also the Director of the Centre for Climate and Environmental Resilience at Newcastle University. Keith Bowers, who's Engineering Director with Cowie in the UK and Project Director for tunnels on the Lower Thames Crossing. And finally, Tobin Hughes, Managing Director of Transport North East. So we're coming at it from academic perspective to some extent, from those that actually own the problems in terms of Cambridge Partnership and Transport North East, and the engineers who will actually engineer the solutions of what we find to deliver on that decarbonisation and resilience. So I'm going to start with a question, individual questions to each of the panelists. I'll start with Ali. Ali, what do you feel are some of the most pressing challenges for road and rail in terms of decarbonisation?
Thanks, Phil. Big question to start with.
Ali, sorry, I'm giving you the big question. That wasn't the question I meant to ask you. Sorry, apologies. What are the most pressing challenges for road and rail in terms of decarbonisation, and why should we utilise data to help us address those challenges?
Okay, thanks, Phil. I mean, obviously, as a data person, I think data has a role to play across the board in both road and rail and the other sectors that we need to decarbonise in transport in the UK. I mean, clearly the challenge is to reach zero emissions in transport. I mean, we hear net zero, but actually transport doesn't have much of a net part. So the challenge is getting our transport emissions to zero, and data plays a role in understanding where those emissions are coming from. I mean, we don't have meters on the exhaust pipe of all of the cars in the UK, so we need data to understand the scale of those emissions, the geographic distribution of those emissions, the social distribution of those emissions from different societal groups. And we need data as well to understand the effectiveness of any of the policies that we might implement in order to get those emissions down to zero in the coming years. So data helps us to understand the scale of the challenge in terms of where we are now, and not just scope 1 and 2 emissions, but scope 3 emissions. So when we're thinking about electrification of transport, it would be very easy to just push the carbon emissions out into the electricity sector and say that that's not transport's problem anymore. But obviously, that's not probably a good approach to take. So data on how people are currently using the system is crucial. And I think this is where we'll probably come on to this later in the session. What that data then is used for is really important too. So how we use the data to feed into models and simulations and scenarios of the future to give us a better understanding of, when we're looking at decarbonisation, how we might do that, whether it's through behaviour change, through technology change, through infrastructure change, but also then what those changes, as you mentioned in your introduction, might do to the resilience of the transport system. So how we can use data to inform models of future network performance under different climate scenarios, etc. So there is a huge challenge in getting transport to zero emissions, and I think data feeds in across the whole spectrum of how we might do that.
Okay, thanks. Keith, obviously, as the industry representative on this panel, you'll actually be engineering the solutions of how do we build more decarbonised infrastructure and how do we make it more resilient. And clearly, you're leading on that on the delivery of the lower Thames tunnels and the like. So 2 questions around that. What data and what data sets exist to help you make the decisions on the design of such a big piece of infrastructure? And how could we better utilize, or where are there gaps in the data that you feel would be needed to make better decisions and better design decisions on such infrastructure?
So the key data sets and models that exist, I think part of the challenge we find is that they're quite patchy. We know quite a lot about some things, we know less about other things, and quite a lot of the challenge we've been through has been drawing together the data. We've essentially been on a journey to firstly baseline the carbon footprint of the work we're planning, and that's fed by various different sources. So we have quite good understanding of embedded carbon, for example, in various materials we use, and typically our industry in new build works will use lots of materials like steel and cement. We've got much better at understanding what is available in the marketplace, how different sources make a big difference to the embedded carbon for apparently sort of similar materials. So we've got very interested in the transport of the materials, the energy sources that are used behind them, all the sort of things that go into now an environmental product declaration for materials. But there are gaps it's quite easy to miss. Sometimes energy consumption, I think we're much less aware of than we have been of the materials that we physically put into the new infrastructure. So things like how we fuel our equipment turns out to be one of the biggest factors in the overall carbon footprint of what we do. that takes us into new areas. We know a lot about diesel, but now we're exploring things like hydrogen as a fuel. We're exploring greater use of battery electrics or electrification in general. We don't have, as a sector, the detailed knowledge of those things, so we're having to work quite hard to understand the supply and to put numbers against the carbon within it. So a lot of our work is actually around exploring those sources and then pulling it together into overall models and tools that allow us to plan as we go forward.
Okay, thanks, Keith. What about the resilience aspect? You know, you're designing this infrastructure that's going to last for 50, 100 years. How do you take into account the impacts that climate change have now, but what those impacts may well be in 20, 30, 40 years' time as we see more extremes of climate change? And obviously that will follow on to what Hayley tells us about her models later.
There are some fairly simple, direct things that we're well aware of. So working in an area like the Thames Estuary, we are acutely aware of flood risk, and flood risk is changing with climate change. So we are dependent on projecting forward what will happen. You know, we're looking at higher flood levels in the future and planning for those. I think that's relatively straightforward to engineer. Part of my concern would actually be about the sort of the unknown factors at the moment. What else will happen that maybe we haven't picked up, and also how user behaviour and so on may change as well. Demand may change. It's very easy to think that the infrastructure we're creating today will be used by people just like us forever. Whereas in fact, most of our transport infrastructure we build, and road and rail infrastructure operates for centuries typically. So there changes in behaviour will be a part of the uncertainty as well. We need to endeavour to address that in design.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When you see estimates on usage on rail and new road infrastructure, quite often what is modelled and what is estimated is not quite what happens in reality. So that's a really important point. Thank you. Hayley, we mentioned the impacts of climate change and the expectation of more extremes of weather going forward. So how do we account for changes in climate and extreme weather events using data? I know you have these weather models that are right at the heart of what we're doing within DARE.
Yeah, so I guess over the last decade or more, we've been developing very high resolution climate models with the UK Met Office. These are very high resolution models. They actually resolve convective processes, so even processes like thunderstorms within them. So we can actually look at things like really intense rainfall that causes flash floods. We can look at things like hail and lightning, as well as the sort of more normal things that we might want to look at in terms of big windstorms, for example, and very large scale flooding. So these models are available. We run them, we force them with greenhouse gases. They're the same sort of models that we use for weather forecasts in the UK. So as I say, very high resolution, and they enable us to basically explore what might happen to extreme weather in the future. I mean, there's lots of, I suppose, fairly certain impacts in the future. The winters are going to get much wetter. There's going to be much more flooding. So I think we're expecting many more winters like the winter we've just seen, actually, with lots of severe storms, many more high winds, more expansive flooding and more intense rainfall as well within those storms. So you could potentially get quite serious surface water flooding as well as these sort of river floods as well, and the potential for more storm surges as well alongside those severe storms. In the summers, we expect much hotter weather and big heat waves like we saw in 2022, for example, with that first 40-degree day in the UK. We're expecting many more of those types of events in the future. the heat waves will become longer as well and more persistent. And of course, the infrastructure has to deal with those type of things as well. I suppose the things we haven't thought probably enough about at the moment are the sequences of weather that might matter. Yeah, so how those different things come together to actually cause problems with systems, particularly things I think like temperature variability. You know, if you get very hot weather followed by cold weather, or these big ranges of temperature variability can be really, really important. If you actually get very wet conditions followed by wind, for example, you tend to get a lot more damage to certainly energy networks as well. And it's also how those interactions between the different infrastructure networks work. But yeah, we do have models we can rely on, I think, to basically give us pictures and storylines of how that future might evolve, that we can then test our models against to look at different net zero pathways as well.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, that really illustrates how data and the effective use of that data is right at the heart of what we need to be concerned about with the decarbonisation and the resilience. So Tobin, as one of the kind of problem owners here, in terms of running transport for the Northeast region, what sort of predictive capabilities do a local or regional authority need to really steer your understanding of decarbonisation and the future resilience of your transport system, so you can make the right decisions, the right investments, and balance the choices that you have with the money that or the limited resources that you have to deliver all of the transport system?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I can't say that, sorry, Hayley was a fantastic speaker to come after. I can't say it enough, because she's almost answered the questions that I was about to pose. What I think it's worth dwelling on is the users of transport systems are real people who are experiencing the effects of our lack of resilience on a day-to-day basis. And of course, the people who work on the transport systems are trying their best to cope with limited resources to actually grapple with it. There was a real life example in the northeast of England just last September, which I think can exemplify it nicely, which is why what Hayley said resonated so well. Each year, the world's largest half marathon takes place in the northeast of England, the Great North Run, where about 50,000 runners run from one part of the region to the other, quite often accompanied by about 50,000 spectators, who then all need to be transported home again using our local metro and bus network. And last year, all of the factors that have been talked about came home to roost at once. It was an intensely hot day to begin with, so many people ran the course and felt the side effects of heat exhaustion at the end of it, much more than they would be expected to do normally for the British climate. And just as most competitors were going across the finish line, the heat turned to a intense rainfall, the likes of which we hadn't experienced in this region for a decade. And that inevitably led to flash flooding on a very localized basis. Lots and lots of roads were underwater, lots of pavements, and indeed large parts of our metro system, exacerbated by many of the infrastructure failures that we try to combat. Drainage was blocked, there were culverts that were blocked, sewage systems failed. The road network was in gridlock, and therefore emergency vehicles and infrastructure maintenance vehicles couldn't get there to sort out the problems fast and quickly enough. So many lessons on one day, including for the people that were involved in it, who switched from suffering from heat exhaustion, many of them, to exposure as they were sitting around waiting for trains that weren't coming, soaking wet and in sudden cold. So what can we do to try to combat these types of events in the future? Well, more precise weather forecasting is number one. There was weather forecasting. It did say there might be some rain, but it was changing by the minute, because these are very unpredictable weather events that can morph from 10 minutes to the next 10 minutes. Obviously, better knowledge about the assets from the infrastructure managers, whether that is the water company maintaining the water systems in the area, or the railway and road managers, to know where their key vulnerabilities are and prioritise how they carry out asset maintenance and renewals. And I should say, you know, away from the flash flooding that we just talked about, equally the same is true for vegetation management nowadays, the effects of soil erosion, the effects of heat on infrastructure like overhead line systems can sag quite significantly beyond their expected range, and something that I think Keith mentioned, which is the impact on passenger behaviour and the customers who have a different set of needs when these types of weather events affect them. We can resource management of events differently. St John Ambulance were needed much more that day than would normally be the case, and how we provide information to the users of our transport networks, guided by better data as the situation is changing dynamically. These are all real world things that are happening to providers of transport systems every day, and we've really got to work with those who can help us to understand what is happening, provide the data to drive new ways of being and new ways of planning, so that we can do a better job.
So it's very multifaceted in terms of dealing with these challenges. A whole bunch of different stakeholders and organizations need to be involved and ideally ready to meet these challenges. And as Hayley says, the impacts of the extreme weathers, whether that be heat, wind, or rain, are going to get worse. So moving on, Dan, again, looking from the local authority, regional authority perspective, what do you see are the benefits of all these stakeholders working together to achieve a better understanding of decarbonised transport systems, what's needed, but also how you adapt when these extreme weather conditions actually hit you?
Thanks, Phil. So I think there's two things that kind of play here. One is we need to recognise the importance of the transport system, and Tobin talked or gave an example there of what happens when it goes wrong. You know, transport is critical to our local communities. It's the way that they access jobs, education. You know, it supports equity within communities, and you know, when it does go wrong, it has a real kind of impact on people's lives. But we've got this huge challenge, which is climate change. And, we recognise that we need to decarbonise both our transport systems and the way that we deliver infrastructure. As a council, we recognise that, we declared a climate emergency in May 2019. And then we've also worked to develop and adopt a climate and environment strategy, which has a commitment to be net zero by 2045. And that's in an area where, we've got huge plans for growth. So as many of you may be aware, Michael Gove has announced an additional 150,000 houses to be delivered in Cambridge, which is going to put severe pressure on an already at capacity transport network and system. That means that we're going to need to build more infrastructure. So if you think about transport infrastructure, there are multiple players that are involved in the development of the infrastructure itself and then the delivery of the transport system. So, we're not just thinking about roads or rail or cycleways on their own. They're all interlinked with other different types of infrastructure. So, we need to think about power infrastructure and how we begin to decarbonise the transport system. So the interplay between the transport system and the power networks. We have a real issue with water in Cambridgeshire, and that's preventing the development of infrastructure at the moment. So there is a planned busway to the west of Cambridge, and because of severe water shortages, there's a condition which is preventing that from coming forward. And so, we need to think about how water and the work that we're planning, the infrastructure that we're planning, the interrelationships between them, and then things like connectivity. And then when it comes to the actual delivery of the transport system itself, obviously there are a number of private operators that will deliver the transport systems, so whether that's bus or rail. So, a really complicated picture of stakeholders. And obviously, if we're going to decarbonise both the transport system and our infrastructure, We need to bring all those different players together, and we need to be able to do things like exchange data. Now, as an organization, I think we are still relatively data immature. We have data. A lot of it sits within systems where it's difficult for us to extract it and reuse it. We don't really think about how we structure it for reuse and the use of standards, which allow data to be easily exchanged between different players within the local area, but also nationally. And actually, do we have the right tools to be able to draw the intelligence and insight that we need to be able to both plan? So, you know, when we're thinking about developing and planning infrastructure, we need to have the right tools in place that help us to understand actually what is the impact of that infrastructure on our pathway to net zero, both, you know, in the short, medium and long term. But also we need to, you know, really think about how those kind of models that we're using, the tools that we're using at the moment, how we can begin to pull, say, a transport model together with a model that may be held by another organization, and the kind of the standards and open infrastructure that we would need to be able to do that. And then also thinking about the governance. So obviously that's really important. So, you know, when you're exchanging data between organizations, if you're potentially bringing models together, what's the governance structure that needs to stand, to kind of sit over there to give accountability to our local members and councillors?
Okay. Oh, sorry, Dan.
You know, so you know, I think a really big challenge, but collaboration is going to be critical to all of that.
Sure. Okay, that's interesting. So hearing a lot about collaboration and the use of data. We heard from Keith, Dan, and Tobin that we've got to think about the users and what their behaviour is going to be going forward. So, Ali, your modelling is largely agent-based modelling, trying to model individuals and how they behave in these situations. How do you think that's going to play into what we're trying to achieve in DARE and looking at the future impacts on our transport system of climate?
Well, I think Tobin made the point that, you know, the important people often in the transport system are the users, and that's where agent-based models, I think, come in, that we try to represent the users of the transport system in those simulations. And that then allows us to understand better, I think, the kind of behavioural responses to both decarbonisation and to making the networks more resilient in the future. For example, if we move large numbers of people from private cars to public transport or walking and cycling, what does that do to their choices of routes and their choices of destinations? What does that do to the parts of the infrastructure which will now be much more important than they were previously? So therefore, how does it change the resilience pattern that we see in our urban areas or non-urban areas, which then, as Hayley explained so clearly, would then be facing these future extreme weather events. So what we're trying to do with agent-based models is to get into that behavioural space and understand how the people who use the system may respond to either new infrastructure or different pricing mechanisms or other policies that we can put in place in order to try and tackle that decarbonisation challenge. But I think that the use of an agent-based model really brings to the fore the data integration challenge. That to do that kind of modelling, if you think through the chain from climate impacts through to policy responses to improve resilience, we need to bring in the climate modelling that Hayley talked about, the future extreme weather events. As Tobin said, you know, they're very spatially localized sometimes and very hard to predict, but, you know, you might have a rainstorm over a certain part of the network. So we need to get the data out of those models, but then into hazard models that will simulate the surface water flooding that we see or the high temperatures that we see with a spatial impact. And then we need to think about how does that actually disrupt the network, be it the road network, the rail network, the walking and cycling network. And then the agent-based model comes in with how people might respond to that disruption, and that depends on their socioeconomic characteristics, the age of the person, the gender of the person, the income of the person. There's lots of different things that we need to get a handle on to understand how those responses might play out, and that hopefully will then shape the kinds of adaptation responses that we need to put in place.
Yeah, and that's really important, because at the end of the day, it's the people with probably from that don't have a great deal of money, for the lower socioeconomic classes that have less flexibility on how they can adapt to these challenges, which is something we've got to absolutely bear in mind when going forward with our future transport design. I'd like to move on to a question really for Keith, Dan, and Tobin, and it's really for Hayley to answer it as well after we've heard from them. Hayley's telling us about this wonderful model she has that can predict how weather caused by climate change will become more extreme, and you may get lots of, you know, almost different sorts of weather coming one after the other, which multiply the effects. Now, I know she can't predict that on Tuesday, the third Tuesday in March in 2050, it's going to be pouring down in Manchester, although it probably will be, and how much. But from your point of view as the engineers who design the systems, Keith, and in terms of those that have to say what you want from a transport system, what is that sort of information that you need now that will help you make the decisions on how to design and operate and maybe adapt your infrastructure to 2050 onwards? I'll start with Keith and then go to Tobin and Dan.
I think the classic design engineering response to that at the moment is to say that all of those things are informing us about risks, and we would tend to, you know, perhaps the new modelling identifies some risks we hadn't previously identified, and we will then factor that into the constraints or the requirements we put into a design. But if you sort of zoom out to the bigger picture, I think this whole conversation is neatly demonstrating one of our fundamental challenges, which is this problem is becoming immensely complicated. What we're tending to do is add value to more and more things. Traditionally, we looked at one sector, we might have looked at building a road or building a railway station, something like that. And we probably did, based a lot of our decision making, frankly, on cost and time considerations. These days, we're now seeing, I think, a really strong case, particularly when you look at things like climate change, for arguing we should start our planning looking at a whole system of systems. We should look at maybe at a regional level at everything that is going on there and how it interacts. So that brings a great deal of complexity in. And then we're now saying we value far more things. Cost and time obviously still matter to us, but other parameters, you know, whether it's carbon or other social value type of measures, those come into the equation. I think a real part of the challenge for our design community going forward is just how to embrace that sheer complexity and scale and develop design processes that can speak to that.
Okay, thanks, Keith. That's a really good message. Tobin, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, well, I'll try. So Keith is the engineer here, so he'll articulate it better. But when designing the assets that you'll deploy on your transport network, the engineers will specify a range of conditions that they want to achieve. And I guess the range of temperatures that you could expect to see in the UK climate 30 or 40 years ago is quite significantly different to today at both ends of the scale. And so that means that you are now specifying a different type of railway carriage or a different type of road surface or whatever it may be, recognizing that it's going to have to deal with much more intense heat or much more prolonged levels of frost. And that goes to all types of asset, whether it's how long you expect bricks to last when you're building a bridge parapet, or how long you expect the wheels on your trains to last for, or other parts or critical components which may be more prone to rust, or the effects of heat melting them or causing them to sag. And that, of course, that can be done because there are trains that run through deserts very well, and there are trains that operate in the Arctic Circle very well. But to get them to do both requires cost, additional budget to pay for it with. Also, it requires a higher degree, I think, of human interaction, whether it's the clever people who are on this call monitoring the data that's being generated by your assets, or whether it's boots on the ground people who are inspecting things with a higher level of frequency than used to be the case. That, of course, itself adds more cost, but I think it also adds more risk, and that, that's what Keith opened with, the variability, the types of new materials that we might be dealing with, and just more things to be coping with add to the risk. And the bottom line here, I think, is the society that we live in that uses transport and relies on it does need to be more prepared to see a higher level of failures, albeit failures that we grapple with and can fix more quickly as we adapt.
Yeah, very interesting message at the end. Thanks, Tobin. Dan.
Yeah, and I think so. Tobin was talking about risk then, and one of the key risks that we need to understand is a cascade risk. So, if there is flooding and the flooding knocks out the power system, and we decarbonize our bus network, for instance, by electrifying it, what does that mean for the delivery of transport in the city? So, how are all these bits of infrastructure related? And, if an event affects one part of the system, what knock-on effect does that have on the rest of the system? And then how do we plan for and address that? So I think that's kind of going to be critical to understand. Keith talked about the complexity. So from a local authority perspective, when we've got our transport planners who are planning the system, when we've got operatives who are, managing the transport system, I think we probably need, and we do need complex systems, but we need to be able to input or output that in a way that people can understand and use. So, I think one of the things that it's going to be really interesting to explore through the DARE Hub is how we output, the complex decisions that are potentially going to be made by these systems in a way that people can easily understand and then act on them. Because that's the important bit about data and models, is it's what do you do with the outputs from it, and what does that mean for you as a local authority? So yeah, I think, it is a huge challenge. I think, as Tobin said, one of the key things is going to be how, as a local authority, we respond to it, but more importantly, how we communicate to our local residents, and how they then respond to it and change their behaviours. The other thing I will just add is I think we're going to need better and better data, particularly at a hyperlocal level. So beginning to think about hyperlocal temperature sensing, so that we can understand how temperatures vary in a local kind of area. And then we're already thinking about things like hyperlocal flood sensing and how we can begin to predict when a flooding event may happen and how serious it is in kind of real time.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Just getting a couple of questions coming in from the audience, but before we do that, Hayley, you've heard some of the demands and expectations from our local and regional authorities and from industry about how they design and how they specify systems and the risks associated with that. So your weather model, how does that help them going forward?
So, I think there's two things. I think that a lot of the things that have been talked about here, I absolutely agree with this need for a system of systems approach. And I think basing it on a regional basis probably makes a lot of sense. Actually, you need to look nationally too, but distilling it down to regions makes sense, and also then ties into other decisions that are being made on probably should be made anyway on a regional level in terms of things like energy supply. How much are we going to go towards electric or hydrogen or different types of net zero energy in different parts of the country. I think the other thing that comes out quite clearly is the need for a better, more thinking about not just long-term climate adaptation, but it's all about disaster risk management. Actually, how do you actually change your operations? How do you actually do that response recovery bit better to become more resilient? Because there are going to be, and we see them frequently now, right? Events that affect transport systems. And there's going to be more of those in the future, potentially. And some of them we're not going to be able to design ourselves out of. Imagine if, say, Storm Daniel happened in the UK. So that produced 3 years worth of rainfall in 2 days, right? It hit Greece last year. That could happen here. And we can't design against that kind of thing. But what we do need to do is be thinking about how we can actually get the systems back up and running more quickly. And I think the other thing that we really need to be thinking about is what Daniel was talking about, is cascading hazards and cascading risks. And in particular, I think the fact that we silo hazards as well. So we think about heat separately to flooding. We do this in the water industry as well. We manage droughts and floods separately. We need to stop doing that too. Because then we can have a much more systems-based approach to water availability as well, and really think about how do we actually trap this excess water in the winter to use it in the summer. We're going to have to do that too. But if we stop taking this siloed approach to treating hazards separately, we'll start to see that there are physical connections between them, and we need to plan for those sequences. I mean, in terms of how we can use the data then, Phil, I think that we do need better forecasts. That's a separate issue, but we can also use the information we have more effectively, probably. What's difficult is that transformational step. These data sets are really, really big. They're in NetCDF format. They're not things that operators and infrastructure managers can necessarily use. So it's a case of working together in dialogue, and I think that's what DARE is going to do really well, actually. That we all work together to actually try and use the best climate information, try and use these storylines in the future, but actually push them through existing models of infrastructure systems, and also try to generate new ones as well. But it's not something that any one organization can do on their own. We absolutely have to collaborate on this.
That's a really, really good message. As you remember, one of the key things about DARE is we're not just looking at transport infrastructure, but related infrastructure such as comms and energy. And also we're looking at our systems approach. So we actually try and understand that interconnectivity and that interdependency between these. I think that's really, really important. So yeah, I hope we'll be on the right path to deliver that, and I'll tell the audience at the end of the meeting how they can engage with DARE. I've got two questions in the chat, so I'm going to open up the first one. It's to Dan, Tobin, and Keith. Could you briefly just talk about the availability and gaps in standards and technologies to support the collection and exchange of carbon data from multiple sources? So, can you collect all the data you need on carbon? Keith, you were talking about this before, about the energy from your operations on top of the carbon footprint of your materials and everything else. Just some thoughts on how you bring those data sets together and what's available, and are there standards to do that, or is there something missing?
Well, we're definitely on a learning journey at the moment with all of this, but from our point of view, we've embraced PAS 2080 and its guidance on carbon management. And we've actually, I think, found that very helpful, and it does start to sort of cascade common messages and behaviours through organisations. So we've sought to align things like lower Thames. We've sought to align our supply chain around that. The collection and exchange of carbon data certainly has been challenging as well. We've progressed through a sort of a journey we've done in other areas where we started off in spreadsheets, and then we've realised the advantage of moving to dedicated tools. But we're, I think, quite early on in that process. We will get better over time, I'm sure.
Right, thanks. Dan?
Yeah, so we are relatively early in our journey when it comes to carbon data, but just to relate our experience with transport data, which is an area that I have worked in, I mean, one of the first things that we did was try to understand as an organization what data we have. So we did a data audit, we spoke to everyone who was involved in transport and put together a catalogue of all the transport data that we had. We tried to understand where people were using standards, what standards they were using. So, you know, there are established transport data standards such as SIRI, which is for real-time bus data. We then tried to understand how people were using data. So what tools were they using, and beginning to map out what tools were kind of available. We then built a data platform and started to aggregate that data and have a data catalog so that anyone within the organization can understand what data is available. There's quite a bit of metadata in there as well, so they can understand how it was collected. There's various other kind of bits of information that are important for the reuse of that data. And then we've now begun to think about how we integrate that data platform into tools that people can easily use, such as Power BI. Now, we've started to do that around our kind of sustainability and carbon data. There has been a data audit that's gone on, but there is still nowhere for us to aggregate that data and for anyone within the organization to get a kind of a single view of what data is available, what standards are being used. So that's the kind of next bit of work. So, really, as an organization, being able to organize yourself, being able to aggregate data and giving people a view of what's available, I think is really important, but actually has proved quite difficult.
Thanks. Toby?
Yeah, well, I think Keith and Daniel have said most of it. It sounds like there's plenty that my organisation can learn from the work that they've done. Everybody's in a similar place here, where there's a general lack of guidance to start with. There's a shared agreement that we need to start to understand it, but really, I think lack of incentives from central government to really come up with a standard set of measurement, quantification, and then hopefully how you measure your interventions moving forward. I think there are carbon budgets out there that the government has set at a national level, but they haven't been driven down to local authority, certainly not local authority transport functions, and we really will need to get better at that.
Well, it sounds like this is something that maybe DARE can help bring together. It's one of the objectives. You're all stakeholders within DARE, but bringing that data together and making it useful and usable for you is really important. And also within DARE, we have a flex fund as well that academics will be able to bid for with stakeholder partners to try and address some of these issues going forward. Thanks, Toby. Very briefly, I've got another question in the chat focused to Alistair and Hayley, just asking you what data granularity of carbon data do you need to validate and test your models? If you can give a very brief answer on this. I don't know who wants to go first.
I can answer that. We don't really use carbon data in the models that I operate, and I think this is one of the challenges that I alluded to earlier, that we don't have a measurement of carbon dioxide coming out of our transport system directly. We have a measurement of the electricity grid's carbon dioxide emissions more clearly, but we have things like fuel sales from petrol station forecourts that we aggregate up to a local authority level to try and guess how much CO2, but it depends on driving style, it depends on vehicle size, there's so much complexity. So we don't really have a firm figure on what the actual CO2 emissions are. And as Tobin says, we don't even have really a carbon budget that we need to try and aim for at that finer local scale too. So there's a lot of work to be done, Phil, as you say, in DARE, and hopefully the fact that in the Hub we have decision makers and engineers and stakeholders and academics together trying to tackle some of these problems, that we can start to get a better handle on what we actually need in terms of that granular data to answer the questions that the challenges that we have.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Hayley?
Not much to add. I think that that one of the things we do need is metrics. We need to work out what we need to measure. So that would be about progress in decarbonisation and also progress in resilience. And interestingly, I was having a similar conversation with the energy industry on Friday at another workshop, where we were talking about, what type of metrics could you put together to measure improvements in resilience in the energy industry. I think there's we need to do this both for mitigation and for adaptation, so decarbonisation and resilience planning, because it's important that we can actually measure progress as well as we move towards these goals of net zero and resilience.
That's a really important point, because at the end of the day, we will be measured on progress in some way, because everybody likes metrics, particularly funders. So we need to find ways of being able to show that there is a pathway towards making our transport systems more decarbonised and resilient. That's really, really useful. Thank you. I'm seeing some other questions, but I'm running out of time to ask other questions from the audience at the moment. So what I was going to do is just go back. We've got 10 minutes left, or 8 minutes, and ask each of the panelists in one sentence, what's the one thing you expect from DARE which will really make a difference for you and your industry, or the organizations you work for? So Keith, I'll start with you.
As a project, we've set out on Lower Thames to make it the greenest that we can. We've been on quite a learning journey, and a lot of these things we're talking about resonate. I think what DARE can offer is some of the joining up to share those experiences, you know, the good and the bad, to help us all move forward as a sector.
Okay, that's really useful. Hayley.
I suppose what I like about DARE is that it brings together net zero and resilience in the same project. Now they're treated separately at national government level, and it's really, even in the net zero plans and the strategy, there's not much about resilience. So I think it's really good that there are projects that are thinking about how you bring those two things together, and how we bring them together across a systems of systems type approach as well, centering on transport.
Okay, thanks. Tobin.
Yeah, I think it's the ability to collaborate with people, not just from the transport sector, but with academics and for people with suppliers as well. Just the different techniques, the different cuts of analysis, and the different data sets. I think together, there's no way that my team could generate even 1/10 of it in their own thinking, because they've got jobs to do, and their jobs aren't managing the impact of climate change or even managing the resilience. Their jobs are to keep the transport network running and to make sure we've got the strategies and policies aligned to achieving regional objectives. So working with partners so that we can actually find the intersect between what we do and what they do, and generate knowledge and learning between us, will make a big difference.
Okay, interesting. The fact it's not their job to worry about that worries me a little bit, because this is reality. This is where this is going to be the impact on the transport system of the future. So it all needs to be in the same pot, in the same strategy, in the same owned by the same group of people to make it happen. But okay, thank you. And last but not least, Dan.
So just to echo what Tobin said, the one thing that I'm really hoping that we get out of our involvement in DARE is collaboration. So, the only way that we're going to solve this huge challenge is by collaborating. And that's, as local authority with academia and with business. I think the second thing is the development of tools which can be used by our transport planners, the people that are operating our infrastructure, that are easy to use, that give them insights and intelligence that they need to do their job, and help them to really begin to plan adaptation and mitigation in infrastructure projects and the delivery of transport systems.
That's a really important message. We hope we're democratizing the outputs of DARE so everybody can use it. Mentioning DARE, I'd like to just tell you how you can get involved. We are a hub. We want to bring in stakeholders from across the spectrum, and to do that, we're holding a series of stakeholder meetings called co-creation workshops. The next one actually is next Monday in York, and there are a few places left at that. If you are interested, get in touch with Livia, and we can let you know whether this space is available. There will be a whole range of other stakeholder events going forward. There's another 3 scheduled for this year. We want to bring in all this expertise and all these different perspectives to make sure we can deal with the problems that you all have and the expectations that you all have. I'd also say that the DARE website is actually being opened today. We've had a while developing it, and you can go on there and sign up for DARE and getting information on the DARE project. So just to finish, I'd like to thank I'd like to thank our contributors today, Keith, Ali, Daniel, Tobin, and Hayley. That's really informative, gave a really good breadth of the challenges that we have. Thanks to Olivia for organising it, and to the Transport Decarbonisation Week for allowing us to host a webinar as part of their series. Thank you for your input. You realise we're really at the start of a journey, which is super complicated, but we really are driven to deliver some real outputs that can help the country as a whole understand how we go forward and how to make the best investments in making our transport system decarbonised and resilient. So thank you.